So, well, it's good to see you all this morning. So very good to be with you. It's wonderful to see so many people here, so many new faces. I think I met 6 or 7 new people, new families here this morning, and I'm just so happy about that. Um, Whatever circumstances brought you here, I'm guessing maybe for some of you it had something to do with an event that happened a few days ago. Whatever brings you into this congregation, please know that as our mission says, that we aspire to be a safe and welcoming place for all. And all means all. And I just want you all to know that we mean it, that this is a community that's rooted in love and peace and justice. And we welcome every person, no matter who you are, where you come from, who you love, what you believe. We welcome everyone. So, Tori, thanks for sharing those words from Nelson Mandela. I had read a book of his letters that was published several years ago, and found that excerpt. I think part of it was from his autobiography, part from the letters. But that particular reading it always touches my heart, and I'm very glad to be able to share it with you. Now, I want to spend most of my time this morning talking about the roots of the courage and the hope that sustained Nelson Mandela for 3 decades of imprisonment. Where does such hope come from? How can anyone cultivate it? And in those moments when we are frightened and in despair, how do we find a path back to hope? But before I get to Mandela, let me just say a few words about what happened earlier this week. And let me just begin by saying how fearful and frightening these last few days have been. I am myself still in shock, and every time I think about the next 4 years, I'll just be honest, filled with dread. During the first Trump administration, I was the minister of a Unitarian Universalist congregation in Northeast Ohio, and I can so vividly remember the heaviness that was on the hearts of almost everyone in the congregation, myself included. Right after that election in 2016, I know many of us couldn't imagine how so many of our fellow citizens voted for a candidate who had spent so much of his campaign demonizing immigrants, demeaning women and people of color, and doing everything in their power to turn people against one another. And as bad as that campaign was, the next 4 years were worse. Several years before Trump came into office in 2017, that congregation had developed a pretty sustained and vibrant immigration ministry, and several of the families that we had gotten to know had begun attending the church and eventually signed the membership book. Once Trump took office, the level of fear among those families was indescribable. They were afraid of being torn apart and deported back to countries they had been forced to flee due to the threat of violence at home. And it was that climate of fear that led that congregation I was serving at the time to eventually to decide to become a sanctuary church and host a family from El Salvador for over 2 years. I tell you all this simply to say that while the results of last week's election have stirred so many memories and feelings in me, and I'm fairly confident in many of you, the threat posed to those who are already marginalized in our society and who have been scapegoated by political leaders, that threat is real, serious, and dangerous. I have to say that over the last few months, I have been so disheartened by the way the trans community, which already experiences violence far above the national average, has been vilified. I've been equally disheartened by the way immigrants have once again been used as scapegoats, and how so many people gleefully cheer on calls for mass deportations without stopping to think what that means. stopping to think about the harm that will be caused to families, to children, and I might add, to the U.S. economy. I'm also disgusted by how easily we dismiss the clear and present danger to the lives of women who are being denied reproductive health care by physicians fearful of prosecution. And finally, I'm afraid for all people of color and those from non-Christian religions who are threatened by the hatred and intolerance of white Christian nationalism. My apologies for the venting. As you can tell, I'm pretty upset, guessing many of you are as well, and I'm very worried about what the next 4 years will hold. And I, again, am so fearful of what will happen to those who who are not protected by the cloak of white male privilege, as I am. And I guess it's my sense of despair that draws me to preach today about Nelson Mandela. As difficult and even hopeless as our situation appears to be, I'm not sure it can compare to what Mandela endured for much of his life. I can still remember that glorious day when the world watched as Nelson and Winnie Mandela walked hand in hand through prison gates and into the light of freedom. The outpouring of love and joy in South Africa and across the world was incredible, and I can only hope that we will experience a similar elation in a few years. Nelson Mandela experienced and witnessed firsthand the brutality and indignities Black South Africans were subjected to on a daily basis. But he refused to accept a system that privileged the white minority over the Black majority. He joined the African National Congress as a young man and dedicated his life to ending apartheid. His arrest and imprisonment could have easily led him to give up the struggle and to lose hope for a free South Africa. But he never gave up, and he never lost hope. In the excerpt from Mandela's writings that Tori read earlier, you got a brief taste of what prison life was like. Every day, the authorities tried to rob Mandela and the other political prisoners of their humanity and their dignity. Mandela spent considerable time in solitary confinement, and many of his days were consumed by the mind-numbing and back-breaking labor of splitting rocks in a dusty courtyard unprotected from the hot sun. I think we've got a couple of photographs there. He was rarely allowed to see his family, and his request to attend the funeral of his eldest son was cruelly denied. Mandela's only contact with the outside world were the letters he received and wrote. And what those letters and Mandela's autobiography reveal is the power of hope to sustain human beings through the darkest times and the critical role played by several factors. And I want to talk about 3 of those factors this morning: integrity, self-care, and especially the power of love and community for creating and sustaining hope. So let me begin by saying a word about Mandela's courage and integrity. As I mentioned before, prison authorities used everything in their repertoire to break his spirit. Fear, intimidation, back-breaking work, isolation, boredom, everything you can imagine was inflicted on the prisoners. And as Mandela himself acknowledges, he and others were terribly afraid for themselves and for their families. But they never let fear stop them from living their values and their convictions, and for day by day, just being who they were. That's actually how Mandela himself defines courage. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability and the determination to triumph over it. And the way Nelson Mandela and his fellow prisoners triumphed over fear was to continue living life the way they had always lived it. If anything, Those dark times of prison deepened their resolve and commitment to freedom and justice. Listen to these words he wrote in a letter from prison in 1970. Our cause is just. It is a fight for human dignity and for an honorable life. Nothing should be done or said which may be construed directly or indirectly as compromising principle, not even the threat of a more serious charge. And that unwillingness to compromise principle led Mandela to keep resisting and keep demanding dignity and respect. Those struggles were often over what may seem like very small things while he was imprisoned. Getting a pair of sunglasses, asking for a longer pair of pants, time to read and study. But as Mandela recalls, we fought injustice and unfairness wherever we found it, no matter how large or how small. We fought injustice to preserve our humanity. Now, let me pause now to say a word about this connection between living life and sustaining hope. In those moments of deepest despair in my own life, one of the most important sources of hope for me has been to try and keep living my life as best I can, rather than letting myself be defined and owned by my despair. Sometimes, many times, that means simply putting one foot in front of the other. Sometimes it means continuing to work and to struggle. Living with integrity while imprisoned on Robben Island allowed Nelson Mandela and his fellow prisoners to remember that their lives were part of something greater and that they were about so much more than splitting rocks in a prison yard. And there was something else that Mandela did that sustained his hope. Many of you may not be aware that Nelson Mandela was an accomplished gardener. And after years of making requests for seeds and tools, he was finally allowed to plant a vegetable garden on the grounds of Robben Island. Here's a picture of him with his shovel. Now, it wasn't long, because Mandela was such a great gardener, it wasn't long before his garden produced so many tomatoes, chilies, and onions that he began providing vegetables to not only his fellow prisoners, but to the prison officials and the prison kitchen. Now, I think it's fair to say that planting and caring for his garden was most assuredly an act of self-care for Nelson Mandela. As he said in his autobiography, his garden was one of the few things in prison that was entirely his own. The garden became his refuge, a place for peace. Gardening enabled him to quiet his mind and to get lost in the best sense of the word. That's why when someone would ask Mandela how he survived so many years in prison, he would often respond by simply saying, "You must find your own garden." Self-care is such an important and underappreciated part of hope. How can anyone find hope if they are always going, always worrying, always being torn in a million directions, and always caring for everyone but themselves? Mandela understood something that so many activists and sometimes caregivers forget. You cannot change the world. You cannot care for others. You cannot have the kind of hope that sustained Nelson Mandela if you don't take care of yourself. And that leads me to what I think is the most important lesson we can draw from Mandela's life of hope. In the reading, he spoke so powerfully about the care and companionship he received from fellow prisoners. He said, "It would be very hard, if not impossible, for one man, one person alone to resist. I don't know that I could have done it if I had been alone." And the hope Mandela received from his fellow prisoners was echoed in all the love and support he received from the outside world. One cannot begin to measure how much strength Nelson Mandela received from Winnie, from friends and colleagues, and from admirers he had never met. Listen to these words from one of his letters. Throughout the many years of my incarceration, numerous messages of good wishes and hope sent by people from different walks of life have cut through massive iron doors and grim stone walls, bringing into my cell the splendor and warmth of springtime. In those moments, I feel as if the whole world has been squeezed into my tiny cell. I can't imagine more beautiful words about the power of hope and the close and necessary relationship between hope and love. Ultimately, hope is not something we do or can create all by ourselves. Hope is a gift we continually receive, a gift from the loving arms and goodwill of others. Each and every one of us is a source of hope for each and every one of us. The kind word, the card of support, the hot meal we bring over when someone is sick or struggling, that is where hope comes from. Nelson Mandela believed that we are the hope. We are the love. We are the instruments of divine light. Light that can, as Dr. King once said, turn dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows. And if there is one overarching lesson I have learned about hope from Nelson Mandela's life, it is this. When human beings love and care for one another, hope comes alive and becomes a powerful force that changes lives and transforms the world. The hope that sustained Nelson Mandela and his fellow prisoners and so many others in the anti-apartheid movement liberated South Africa. It turned a long and dark yesterday into a brighter and more just tomorrow. And that, friends, is the message that I'd like to leave you with this morning. Darkness and despair. I think many of us, perhaps all of us, are feeling them. They are part of our world, and they always will be. Hope isn't easy. It's not automatic. It's a journey of highs and lows, ups and downs. But remember this, darkness and despair don't have the final say in our lives or in this world. I believe that life and love are too powerful, too bountiful, too blessed to ever be completely banished or cast aside. For all the burdens and struggles that so often fill our days, hope emerges. Hope returns. Hope comes alive. And it comes alive when we live with integrity, when we take care of ourselves, and when we love one another. That's the lesson Nelson Mandela's life offers to us. And it's that hope and that love that will sustain us in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. Amen. Thank you so much for listening, and blessed be.